They didn't have maps, no roads marked with distances, no inns guaranteed to be safe, no way to know before leaving whether the journey would end in arrival or in disaster. When we imagine Jesus walking through Galilee, we tend to picture something calm and almost picturesque, a solitary figure moving serenely through golden landscapes, sandals barely touching the dust, teaching as he goes. But that image misses almost everything that was true about travel in the first century. It removes the weight, the danger, the social complexity, and the physical cost of every single mile. Travel in the ancient world was not a metaphor, it was a material reality, and a demanding one. To understand how Jesus and the apostles moved through the land of Israel, you need to understand what the land actually looked like, what the roads were made of, who used them, what it cost to be on them, and what happened when something went wrong. Because understanding this doesn't just fill in historical background, it changes how you hear the parables. It changes how you read the Gospels. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read every journey in the New Testament. If this kind of deep historical exploration speaks to you, the kind that brings the Bible to life from the ground up, consider subscribing. There's much more of this waiting for you now. Let's begin where every journey in first century Judea and Galilee actually began. Not at the road, but at the door, the house. In most villages across Galilee, places like Capernaum, Nazareth, Cana, Chorazin, houses were built from basalt stone or limestone, low-ceilinged, compact and dark even in daylight. Families of 5, 6, 8 people shared 2 or 3 rooms. Animals were kept in an adjacent lower area or in the same main room during cold months, which meant that the floor of a typical home in winter carried the warmth and the smell of livestock. The walls absorbed years of cooking smoke from open clay lamps burning olive oil. In the morning, the air inside was thick and heavy. Light came through 1 or 2 small openings. There was no glass. Before a journey of any significant distance, preparation began the night before, or several nights before. A man planning to walk from Capernaum to Jerusalem, for example, was facing roughly 130 kilometers of terrain. That was not a weekend walk. It was a journey of multiple days, requiring food, water, sandals in good condition, a cloak thick enough for cold nights, and either a companion or a group. Traveling alone was not merely uncomfortable, it was considered reckless, and in many stretches genuinely dangerous. The roads themselves varied dramatically depending on where you were. In the cities and along major Roman trade routes, you would find paved stone roads, the famous Via Maris along the coast, or the road connecting Jerusalem to Jericho. These were real engineering achievements, wide enough for carts, cambered to drain rainwater, with milestones carved in Latin and Greek. But the moment you left those arteries and turned toward a village, any of the hundreds of small villages scattered across the hills of Galilee or Judea, the road disappeared into a dirt track worn by generations of sandaled feet and loaded donkeys, carved deep into the hillside in some places, barely visible in others. Dust in summer, mud in winter, stone in every season. The body knew the road before the mind did. Travelers in the first century developed an almost instinctive reading of terrain, which slopes drained well after rain, which valley floors turned to clay that swallowed a sandal hole, which ridge paths stayed dry but exposed you to wind so cold in January that a man without a second cloak could lose feeling in his hands before reaching the next village. Sandals were the primary, often the only, footwear. They were simple constructions, a flat sole of leather or wood held to the foot by straps that crossed the instep and wrapped around the ankle. A good pair, well made by a craftsman who knew his work, could last years. A poor pair, or a pair worn past its limit, could fail mid-journey, leaving a traveler with open cuts on stone roads, miles from anywhere. This is why in the Gospels, sandals appear not as incidental detail, but as a marker of status, preparation, and relationship. John the Baptist declares himself unworthy to unfasten the sandals of the one coming after him. Jesus sends out the 12 and specifies, wear sandals, not barefoot, not informal shoes, sandals, the gear of the road. The cloak carried equal weight. In a world without luggage in the modern sense, the outer garment, the himation in Greek, the simla in Hebrew, functioned as coat, blanket, luggage wrap and sleeping mat simultaneously. At night, on the road, it was what stood between a man and the cold ground. This is why the Torah itself in Exodus prohibited keeping a poor man's cloak as collateral overnight. It wasn't sentimentality. It was survival legislation. Without his cloak, a man sleeping outside in the Judean hills in any month outside of July and August was not uncomfortable. He was at risk. When Jesus tells his followers in the Sermon on the Mount that if someone takes your tunic, you should offer your cloak as well, he is not speaking in gentle abstractions. He is describing the most extreme gesture of voluntary vulnerability imaginable to his audience. Giving up your cloak on the road meant giving up your warmth, your shelter, your dignity, and your only protection against the night. The audience heard that and felt it in their bodies. Groups traveled together whenever possible, and this was not merely cultural preference. It was practical risk management. A group of 10 or 15 people moving together along a road presented a significantly less attractive target for the bandits who operated in the passes and isolated stretches between towns. The road from Jerusalem down to Jericho, a descent of roughly 1,000 meters over about 27 kilometers, passed through limestone wilderness with abundant places for ambush. Every person walking that road in the first century knew this. It was not theoretical danger. Josephus and other ancient sources confirm regular incidents of robbery and violence along exactly these routes. This is the road Jesus chose for the parable of the Good Samaritan. He didn't invent the danger, he pointed at it. His audience knew that road. Some of them had walked it. Some of them had been afraid on it. When Jesus places a man beaten and left for dead on the Jerusalem to Jericho road, he is not constructing a hypothetical. He is reconstructing something that happened, the kind of thing that happened, and then asking his listeners to locate themselves within it, the priest who passes by, the Levite who crosses to the other side. Their behavior was not simply moral failure. It also reflected real social and religious calculation. A priest who touched a corpse, or what might have been a corpse, would have become ritually impure, unable to perform his duties in the temple. The road forced a choice between obligation to purity and obligation to a suffering human being. Jesus framed it so that the choice was unavoidable, and he gave the moral victory to the one his audience would least have expected, the Samaritan, the outsider, the one who had no temple obligations to protect. Every detail was load-bearing. Movement through the land was never just physical. In the first century, to travel was to cross invisible boundaries that were as real as any stone wall. Boundaries of region, of ethnicity, of religious purity, of social class, and of gender. Every journey Jesus and the apostles undertook passed through at least one of these layers, and often several simultaneously. Understanding this transforms the geography of the Gospels from background scenery into active narrative structure. Consider the route between Judea and Galilee. The direct path ran straight through Samaria. It was shorter, faster, and far more logical from a purely geographical standpoint. And yet most observant Jewish travelers in the first century chose to go around, crossing the Jordan River eastward into Perea, traveling north through the Transjordan, then crossing back west into Galilee. This detour added days to the journey. It was chosen deliberately, consistently, by people who considered the alternative worse than the extra miles. The hostility between Jews and Samaritans was not simply religious disagreement. It was centuries of accumulated tension, disputed claims over the correct location of worship, Jerusalem or Mount Gerizim, intermarriage accusations, and periodic episodes of real violence. To walk through a Samaritan village as a Jewish pilgrim heading to Jerusalem was to enter territory where you might be refused water, refused lodging, or worse. Luke records an episode where a Samaritan village refuses to receive Jesus precisely because his face was set toward Jerusalem. The disciples, James and John, respond by asking whether they should call down fire from heaven. The anger was not theatrical. It reflected the genuine friction of that road. When John's Gospel records that Jesus had to pass through Samaria, the Greek carries a note of necessity, even compulsion, and then stops at Jacob's well and speaks with a Samaritan woman. The scene carries a weight that is almost entirely invisible to modern readers. He was in the wrong territory, speaking to a woman alone in public, speaking to a Samaritan, asking her for water, which would have been drawn in a vessel he was not supposed to drink from. Every sentence of that conversation violated a boundary that his culture had spent generations constructing. The disciples, returning from the village, are described as astonished, not at the theology of what Jesus said, but at the fact that he was speaking with her at all. This is what travel looked like in the first century. Every step carried context. The apostles learned this gradually, often reluctantly. When Jesus sends out the 12 in Matthew's Gospel, his instructions are precise and logistically specific in ways that reveal exactly how the road worked. Take no gold, no silver, no copper in your belts. No bag for the road, no extra tunic, no sandals beyond what you wear, no staff beyond what you carry. Find a worthy house in each town and stay there until you leave. This was not ascetic theater. It was a deliberate strategy of dependence and hospitality. In the first century world, the network of hospitality was the infrastructure of travel for anyone who was not wealthy. Inns existed along major Roman roads, but they carried a severe social stigma. They were associated with prostitution, theft, drunken violence, and the general disorder of transient populations. A respectable person, and certainly a religious teacher, did not stay at an inn if he could avoid it. Instead, he relied on the ancient obligation of hospitality, the duty, embedded deep in both Jewish and broader Near Eastern culture, to receive a traveler, feed him, shelter him, and send him on his way protected. By instructing the 12 to carry nothing and depend entirely on the hospitality of the towns they entered, Jesus was doing something radical. He was placing his messengers in a position of complete vulnerability. And in doing so, forcing every town to make a decision. To receive them was to receive their message. To reject them was to reject something far larger than the men themselves. The road was the sermon. There is one journey in the Gospels that contains everything. It is not the most dramatic. It does not involve miracles, crowds, or confrontation with religious authorities. It is a walk of about 11 kilometers on a road leading away from Jerusalem, taken by two men on the afternoon of the first day of the week following the crucifixion. The road to Emmaus. Luke describes it with unusual narrative precision. The two disciples are walking. They are talking with each other about everything that had happened. Their faces, Luke says, are downcast. A stranger joins them on the road and walks with them. They do not recognize him. He asks what they are discussing. They stop, and the Greek word Luke uses suggests they stopped moving entirely, planted in the middle of the road. And one of them says, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" What follows is several hours of walking conversation. The stranger opens the scriptures to them, beginning from Moses and all the prophets, interpreting everything concerning himself. And still they do not recognize him. As evening approaches and they near the village, the stranger acts as though he will continue on. They urge him. The Greek is insistent, almost forceful. "Stay with us, because it is toward evening and the day is now far spent." Here, the entire weight of first-century travel culture presses into a single moment. A traveller arriving at a village at dusk without lodging was genuinely exposed. The obligation to offer hospitality was not merely courteous, it was moral. To invite a stranger in as night fell was to take responsibility for his safety. To share your food and your roof, to extend the boundary of your household outward, to include someone who had no claim on you, except need. They urge him to stay because the day is far spent. And because in their world, that phrase meant something concrete and serious. Night on the open road was cold, isolated, and dangerous in ways that required no elaboration for any first-century listener. He goes in to stay with them, and at the table, reclining together in the posture of shared meals that Jesus had occupied dozens of times before, he takes bread, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to them, and their eyes are opened. The Greek construction Luke uses at that moment is the same passive form used throughout the New Testament for divine action. Their eyes were not simply opened by recognition. They were opened. Something acted upon them from outside. And in that instant, on a road they had walked in grief, over a meal they had offered out of obligation, through a conversation they had not fully understood, everything collapsed into clarity. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked to us on the road?" The road, not the temple, not the synagogue, not a mountain or a designated holy place. The road between a city and a village, walked by two ordinary people in the middle of their grief, on an afternoon when everything they had believed seemed to have ended. This is where the recognition happened. This is where the resurrection first became visible. Not in a moment of triumph, but in the breaking of bread at the end of an 11-kilometer walk. Jesus was not a figure who descended into human experience from a safe distance. He walked the same roads. He felt the same dust, the same stones, the same cold when the sun dropped behind the hills of Judea. He understood what it meant to be refused lodging, to rely on strangers, to move through hostile territory, to arrive at a door as evening fell and ask to be let in. The faith that emerged from his life was not constructed from ideas alone. It was built from miles.